The immediate spark for this meeting is an ongoing case in Slovenia, the Rupnik case. But the aim is to start with this case and then to range much further. And so the order of our presenters is to go from particular and then going to more general matters. And so that's what we'll do. I was going to say that the names of our panelists are on the screens. I don't know if I don't see them on the screen. So if I can just summarize that our first speaker will be Ciril Ribičič, who not only is a very senior professor of law at the University of Ljubljana, but in two other capacities is very important. One is that he's a former judge of the Slovenian Constitutional Court himself, and the other is that he is the main complainant against a decision in the Rupnik case in what's called the Supreme Court, but it can't be absolutely supreme because it's subject to review by the Constitutional Court. But there we go. But I think it is important, both for his sake, but also it will be for Professor Shayo, if we get onto him, that he also is a former judge of a very senior court, that neither of them can be expected to have judicial opinions about ongoing legal matters. Now, obviously, Professor Ribičič has put forward his, here we've got Professor Shayo. Welcome, Professor Shayo. That's excellent to see you. I think that Ciril Ribičič has put forward a 65-page complaint to the court so that his views are well known, and he will be giving some of the main points and the logic. And so from that point of view, he's not neutral in this case. On the other hand, it is absolutely the intention not to seem to use this as intervention in cases, a case that is under judgment by the Slovenian Constitutional Court. And so absolute respect will be shown to the Constitutional Court, as well as to any particular cases in the European Court of Human Rights. And so we won't expect our distinguished former judges to go against what are the rules of being a judge. And so I hope you can both relax on that ground. In addition, we have Dr. Rob Williams from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. He, I suppose, is the lead authority on looking at cases of Holocaust distortion, of various problems internationally. But since he is on an international panel as well, that is looking to make some thoughts and recommendations, it again is unfair to expect him to go into ongoing discussions, international discussions today. And I think the rules of the game for him are that he is going to fill in some of the empirical evidence of what has been going on, but won't try and give us an insight into recommendations that may be made in a year's time. Is that correct, as the rules that you want to follow?
Essentially, yes. I'll take historians' prerogative and cast a broad picture and try to assess the causes, but not make specific recommendations.
Yes, I think that that had been what I understood, and then I should explain that Baroness Ruth Deitch. And shall we call you Baroness or Ruth? Baroness. We can't hear you.
Call me Ruth. You can call me Ruth.
Ah, well, we can call you Ruth. Good. Okay. That denies me the pleasure, Ruth, of calling you Baroness. But anyway, there we go. Ruth is very prominent in British discussions, and in at least two ways. One is in a question that is current in Britain about whether a major Holocaust monument should be set up essentially by the premises of the Houses of Parliament, by the House of Lords. And that does bring up some major issues which are important, and I have a great sympathy with Ruth's views, and this goes into the question of how we memorialize. But I think we probably will be not so much discussing that today, although you're very free to, Ruth, but we'll be discussing the other important matter, which is on property restitution. And I think you have a personal interest, but that personal interest in that, it very much represents the feelings and the interests of many other people whose families have come from Holocaust backgrounds, and is arguably a major form of injustice that still survives from the Holocaust. And then finally, I'm going to be talking still more generally, and that conversation will be about another aspect of Holocaust injustice, namely the question of whether slave labor at Auschwitz and elsewhere was legal. And I had the privilege, but the misfortune of negotiating with the German government in the late 1990s on behalf of survivors. And so I'm afraid I bear the scars of those negotiations, and I think that they also have some implications that I'd like to bring in. Okay, so that with that, can we start with you, Professor Ribičič?
I would like to thank Professor Juri Toplak, my colleague and friend, for an invitation to present constitutional complaints against the decision of the Supreme Court in the Leon Rupnik case at a panel of such eminent speakers. So, 2 constitutional complaints have been lodged collectively by 10 individuals, victims of the Rupnik's regime, as well as following organizations: the Association of the National Liberation Movement of Slovenia, the Jewish Community of Slovenia, and the City Municipality of Ljubljana. Leon Rupnik was the key symbolic figure of national collaboration, and his posing in front of Nazi symbols is explicitly indicative of his ideological orientation that led to his criminal activities. His speeches and lectures are available on the web. Among them, the most telling are the appeals to fight the Jewish conspiracy and to support the leading role of the German Reich in Europe. His statement regarding allies and their opponents during the Second World War is along the same lines. Here are his words: "We must calmly and with all the fanatism possible lead the battle against the Jewish domination in the world, the domination that serves Stalin's and Tito's bandits and their helpers, Anglo-American gangsters, while maintaining a strong confidence in the rightness of the European leader of the German folk. Leon Rupnik was the initiator and supporter of the pledge of alliance to the German occupying forces and their leader Adolf Hitler, to whom he toasted for his birthday with his right arm extended in Nazi salute. In addition, he was consistent anti-Semite who in his speeches incited persecution of Jews, in that period the most vulnerable minority group in Slovenia and globally. Similarly, but more seriously, the right to human dignity of the complainants from the Jewish community of Slovenia was violated. More seriously, because Rupnik's activity directed towards destroying and extermination of Jewish people were carried out without taking into account whether or not the Jews were participants of the liberation forces, but due to the mere fact that they are Jews. This is the most evident example of a violation of personal dignity of each one of them. Antisemitism was a permanent feature of his functioning in cooperation with first the fascists and later with the Nazi occupying forces. The military tribunal unquestionably established General Rupnik guilt, and he himself had pleaded guilty, describing his action as a fight against the global Jewish conspiracy. General Leon Rupnik was tried and convicted by the Fourth Army Military Tribunal on August 1946. After the judgment was upheld by the Supreme Court of Yugoslav Army, he was executed. It is very important to understand that on the Slovenian territory, as was the case in many other European countries, immediately after Second World War, extrajudicial executions also took place. However, this was not the case in the trial of Leon Rupnik, which was carried out at the court of law according to the valid legislation, and where Rupnik was convicted and sentenced under the valid criminal law. In the decision from October 2019, the Supreme Court of Slovenia set aside the judgment of military tribunal from. So the main reason that the Supreme Court reversed the judgment against Rupnik was that some offences described in the operative part of the judgment has no reasons as regards these offences. The Supreme Court opinion can be summarized in the argument that such lack of reasons was a breach of the valid procedural norms already at the time of the trial in 1946. While this decision alone was surprising, the Supreme Court further decided to remit the judgment for a retrial at the first instance courts. This would be reasonable in a case in which a new trial could be held. However, in the Rupnik case, a new trial cannot be carried out because the defendant is deceased. Therefore, the first instance court would have to terminate the criminal procedures against the defendant, and Rupnik would be fully protected by the presumption of innocence. Without going into details, the constitutional complaints argue that the Supreme Court judgment reversing the judgment by which Leon Rupnik was convicted violates the human rights set out in the Constitution of the Republic of Slovenia and ignores the general valid principles of international law, especially those that had been formed as principles respected by civilized nations after the Second World War, as well as the right enshrined in the international treaties that are binding on Slovenia. All the complainants are deeply hurt by the fact of setting aside the judgment against Rupnik, the person most responsible for all the grief caused to them and their families. This is why they claim, in the first place, a violation of the right of human dignity. At the time of the trial, the democratic federal Yugoslavia already acceded to the London Agreement, also known as the Nuremberg Statute. That was a legal basis for the future Nuremberg trials against the leaders of Nazi Germany. This is why it's very important to compare basic procedural standards in Nuremberg trials with the standards in Rupnik trial. This comparison clearly shows that in general, procedural standards were in fact higher in the Rupnik trial. It's evident from the case law that the level of reasoning in Nuremberg trials was relatively low comparison to the modern standard. Thus, the Nuremberg Tribunal did not in principle state the concrete evidence and the reasons relating to every single offense and point in the operative part of judgment, but contented itself with a relatively general reasoning. We are convinced that the level of reasoning in the Rupnik judgment was comparable to the reasoning in the Nuremberg trials judgments and was thus in line with the principles of law recognized by civilized nations at the time of the Rupnik trial. The constitutional complaint was also filed by Professor Locke Lampert in his own name, his own capacity, which very similarly based the observance of the Nuremberg standards in the trial of Leon Rupnik. On the 5th November 2020, the Constitutional Court issued an important decision to temporarily suspend the effect of the Supreme Court judgment until the final decision is passed. This decision does not prejudices the court's final decision, but it is significant that the Constitutional Court emphasized irreparable consequences that could ensure if Supreme Court judgment had not been suspended. The decision was passed with 6 votes to 1. Currently, the effect of the Supreme Court judgment reversing the 1946 judgment of the military court is suspended, as is the procedure at the first instance court. Let me tell at the end that assistance to the complainants was offered by criminal law professor of such different generations as Assistant Professor Micha Hafner on the one hand and the oldest Professor Emeritus Ljubo Bautzon on the other. Sadly, Professor Bautzon passed away last year before he could await the final decision of the Constitutional Court. These are his publicly spoken words when constitutional complaints were filed. We are convinced that the Constitutional Court will set aside the judgment of the Supreme Court and thereby protect individual human rights, liberties, and above all human dignity of the direct and indirect victim of Rupnik's crimes against humanity, war crimes, and high treason in the forum of armed and otherwise collaboration with the enemies of the Slovenian nation. I hope that his prediction will come through and that would be no need to start procedure before the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Ribičič. I suggest you turn off the microphone. Dr. Pinto-Duschinsky, I suggest you turn on the microphone.
Right. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Look, thank you very much, Professor Ribičič. That was an excellent beginning and will lead on to questions with the third presentation. Before going on to follow up the question of the role of international courts in these matters, we'd like to go now to Dr. Rob Williams, and I think we introduced before his expertise and also the limitations of what he can say now. He's going to move not to the legal, but to the factual experience that we've been having of these worrying matters concerning the Holocaust in Central and Eastern Europe. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Rob.
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate the opportunity to join everyone today. My goal for the next 10 minutes or so will be to discuss this, I think we can call it a challenge to restorative justice and to the politics of the past, namely the phenomenon of rehabilitation. By rehabilitation, I'm really using an umbrella term that describes efforts to absolve, provide amnesty to, heroize, or otherwise gloss over the words and deeds of individuals and organizations complicit in the Holocaust and other crimes of the Second World War. Before we discuss present-day challenges, however, I think it's important that we remember that rehabilitation, it's not new. Soon after the end of the Second World War and the imposition of strict denazification measures in the Western zones of occupation in Germany, the Western Allies began passing a series of amnesty laws that allowed for the rehabilitation and reconstitution of the German civil service, professions that had been severely diminished due to their complicity in Nazi crimes. This process of amnesty only accelerated after 1949, when it became the responsibility of the newly formed West German government and the Office of the US High Commissioner in Germany. Let's just consider what happened to a few of the war criminals housed at Landsberg prison, which is in Bavaria. In January 1951, about 4,000 West German citizens, including local politicians, went to the then US-controlled Landsberg prison to protest some forthcoming executions. Those set to be hanged were not small fry. They included Otto Ohlendorf, the head of Einsatzgruppe D, fall into German sometimes, that special action group that carried out atrocities against more than 90,000 Jewish and non-Jewish men, women, and children across Ukraine in 1941. Now, Ohlendorf did meet his fate in June of 1951, but other German war criminals had their sentences commuted or annulled, allowing them to enter post-war life. One of the more extreme cases was Martin Sandberger, the head of Einsatzgruppe 1A, which was responsible for the murder of Jews and communists in Estonia. Sandberger admitted personal responsibility for the murders of 350 people, and for these crimes and others, received a death sentence in 1948, which the Americans commuted to life imprisonment after the events of 1951. Over the course of the 1950s, prominent Germans appealed to US authorities for a full pardon. These persons included Carlo Schmitt, one of the authors of the Basic Law and a well-regarded SPD politician, as well as then West German President Theodor Heuss. The latter went so far as to suggest to the US ambassador that German courts might retry Sandberger's case and find him not guilty. Now, there were a number of motivations behind this campaign. Some were personal. Schmitt and Sandberger had been university chums. Others were political. But by December 1957, Sandberger was only one of 4 people remaining in Landsberg prison. Authorities finally gave up in May of 1958 when they freed him, and Sandberger passed away in his Stuttgart apartment almost 12 years ago today. Now, I'm giving you this history not just because it reflects the particular problems of a particular time in the most particular of places, but also because it illustrates some of the dynamics behind present-day cases of rehabilitation. Perhaps, as Norbert Fries noted elsewhere, these mechanisms of amnesty allow for societies that have gone through what he called a unparalleled and moral catastrophe to establish a clean break from their past. And in the West German case, there may be some validity here. Economic miracles and democratic development did rule through much of the 1960s, but it soon became clear in the Federal Republic of Germany that the sins of the past cannot be so easily whitewashed. A healthy and stable democracy requires what Tocqueville might have called a right relation with the past, a willingness to engage with history, warts and all. So let's return to the present. For about 2 decades, there have been significant attempts to rehabilitate the reputations of Holocaust-era criminals. This trend correlates with other trends, notably declines in respect for democratic practice and the rise of a particularly dangerous form of memory politics. a problem that's taken on greater urgency over just the last few years. Now, one might think that this is a problem limited to the rhetoric employed by the Russian president as a pretext for his attacks on Ukraine, but historical memory of the Holocaust has become weaponized and twisted across the international space in a number of countries. Now, clearly, this distortion has security implications, and I would argue so too do cases of rehabilitation. Today's rehabilitation is an international phenomenon. It's not unique to former Axis powers. It happened in countries that were occupied by the Axis, in countries that were neutral during the war, and in countries that were part of the alliance, including our own. It is a shared problem, one that demands a common solution. Now, at times, the so-called rehabilitated have benefited by official processes, like a high court overturning a long past judicial sentence, even when the burden of historical proof shows guilt. Others on this panel have already provided important detail on the 2020 nullification of Leon Rupnik's 1946 death sentence. Now, although the 2020 Slovenian court did not engage with the question of his Holocaust-era crimes, the fact of this decision brings with it a risk that Rupnik may be seen as an absolved hero in certain segments of society. It's also interesting to note that at approximately the same time as the Rupnik decision, a similar case was being considered in Bucharest. Like the Rupnik case, an attempt to revisit, the conviction of Romanian General Nicolae Macic was motivated in part by family members seeking to reclaim lost property. Also like Rupnik, Macic was tried in the immediate post-war era for crimes, in Macic's case, that included participation in the Odessa massacre that led to the deaths of some 22,000 Jews in 1941. Unlike Rupnik, Macic died in prison because King Michael of Romania commuted his sentence to life. Also unlike Rupnik, the Romanian court decided that it could not overturn this conviction because it was not in keeping with that country's juridical norms. Now, these are just two cases among many, but it's important to contextualize this phenomenon on an even broader scale because courts are not always necessary. Other times, parliaments have taken official actions to bring about rehabilitation. This has happened in a number of Eastern European countries like Ukraine, Lithuania, Bulgaria, and others. And there, many of the rehabilitated include persons or organizations who are being valorized for their anti-Soviet efforts, despite the fact that they collaborated with the Nazis in crimes against Jews, Roma, ethnic Poles, and others. At other times, individuals have undergone what we could call cultural rehabilitation, a circumstance made possible by the fact that they were luminaries. There are also those whose existences have been purposefully erased from official memory. One could think of the collaborationist Russian Liberation Army in this case. Some are protected by religious authorities, a very significant complication, I'll grant you, and others escaped justice entirely and went on to post-war fame. To this list, we should include some of the Nazi scientists brought to my country to work on our rocket program. There are even cases today of rehabilitation outside particular national contexts. For example, the writings of the Italian fascist Julius Evola have found purchase in some North American circles, and the works of the Belgian SS officer Léon de Grelle can be found in legitimate bookshops in parts of Eastern Europe. Why is all of this happening? Well, in part, it's because of the difference between history and memory. Collective memory is flawed, subjective, and malleable. You see, memory only needs a narrative and a few prompts. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it has limits because memory cannot adequately grasp historical events like the Holocaust because it's incomplete and it's subject to emotions. A better public memory of the past can only come through an honest engagement with facts and analysis, as opposed to national myths. I've also hinted earlier that there's a security component at play. Rehabilitating the reputations of problematic individuals is often motivated by attempts to rehabilitate old norms, to abandon democratic development in favor of an atavistic politics that rests on social strife and myths of national glory. This leads to a pernicious and fractured national discourse that undermines democracies and provides fodder for reductive and problematic propaganda. So what do? We could decide to do nothing, but then we risk signaling that some actions are excusable. Our common agreement rejects this. Yes, it's always possible to forgive an individual for her or his sins, but we cannot forgive deeds. And in this case, at least, the atrocities of the Holocaust violated our shared moral principles. So to achieve a better balance, we need history, a history, to paraphrase the historian Mark Bloch, himself a victim of the Nazis, that seeks a better understanding. This is not possible if we continue to see the Holocaust through a warped lens. Clarity requires a combined effort. We must ensure that legal and political rehabilitation comes to an end. We must engage with the history in ways that reach non-specialists in ways that resonate. And we must realize that the safety of our shared future rests on engaging with the past, not as we hope it might have been, but rather as it actually happened. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for that. We're slightly going to have to watch time, but I think that these contributions shouldn't have been abridged, and so I'm very, very grateful. Now we come then to a third very important segment, and I'll hand over to Yuri and Andras Shayo, and I'll leave it to you as to how you want to follow up, probably from Professor Ribičič's beginnings, that he made reference to certain rights that were imposed by international courts. Now, we're not having this as a threat or anything like that, but we're looking at the possibilities and the role of international courts in these matters. Over to you, Yuri.
Thank you, Michael. First, let me greet everyone in the name of the organizers, European Academy of Sciences and Arts and Alma Mater Europaea University. It's really wonderful to see you here. And when I speak on behalf of the Academy, I'm most pleased to see Baroness Dietsch here, who has been a member of the Academy for 25 years. Welcome back. Welcome at the event of the Academy. This is I will not present, I will just ask a few questions, Professor Shayo. I would ask Professor Shayo to share your views on maybe on avenues, the relatives of victims of crimes, of those who have been convicted decades ago and now rehabilitated, or their convictions were annulled. What avenues in international law would or could relatives have, if any? And then more specifically, European Court of Human Rights, whether it offers any avenues for relatives of victims of those relatives of victims of those who were first convicted and rehabilitated. I wouldn't ask specifically on a Slovenian case, but in general, because there's cases in several countries of convictions from 1940s or 50s being overturned recently.
Thank you for the opportunity. So as far as the standing of the victims of perpetrators of war crimes, genocide, etc., just a technicality that these victims have to raise the complaint already at the stage of domestic proceedings, except if they don't have standing in the domestic proceedings. So that's just a technical remark, but very important, because that's the first opportunity for for the court to dismiss the case as inadmissible, that it was not raised in substance in the domestic court. Now, the question here is something that I think more or less can be answered on the basis of the Katyn case. The case is called Yanovets and others versus Russia, was decided in 2009. It dealt with the complaint or application of the relatives of those Polish officers who were murdered in Katyn and 2 other places. The problem was, among others, a temporality, but perhaps first I will present what kind of complaint these relatives of the victims could formulate. So they had 2 major complaints. One was that they are victims under Article 3, inhuman and degrading treatment, and they are directly affected because the proceedings, the lack of providing information, in particular in that case, regarding the ongoing investigation in Russia. There was a recognition after 1990 that Russia, or more properly Stalin and Beria, were responsible, or the KGB was responsible for killing about 14 or 15,000 Polish officers in 1940, and they had no access to information. And that caused a kind of distress that reached the threshold of inhuman treatment. So the denial of access to information, the fact that they had no opportunity to learn about the specific fate of their relatives was a source of this. So that was one avenue. The second one was under Article 2, which is the right to life. And what is the issue under the right to life? It was not that the then Soviet authorities killed people, but the right to investigate attempts to right to life. So in other words, this was a procedural demand or requirement that the Russian state failed properly to investigate the murders. There is a general duty to investigate. In that respect, the victims were not, the victims here, the potential or the actual applicants were, as I told you, relatives of the murdered Polish officers. It was not their own complaint that came up, but they were in a way they have inherited the claim. So they acted this time on behalf of the murdered Polish officers. Okay, so we have 2 separate avenues. Both were rejected. Both were found inadmissible by a considerable majority. As to the Article 3 complaint that the relatives suffered, basically they said the problem was one of time, and to some extent the same is true regarding Article 2. These events occurred a long time before the entry into force of the convention. And basically the position of the court was that even assuming that there is a theory that one can, well, how to explain that it's an extremely arcane theory of the court, by the way, developed or established or reaffirmed in a Slovenian grand chamber case, Sili. So the Slovenian colleagues will certainly remember that the problem in Sili was that, although it was death, I think, by negligence, the person passed away before Slovenia joined. And then in this context, the court tried to determine at which point the convention is applicable, because once again, it was about events occurring before. And they said that if it's about fundamental values of the convention, then even if it's very distant and there is an ongoing process, still after a country, a state joins the convention, if it is about a fundamental value, then there might be applicability of the convention. But remember, all what happened in 1940. The convention is entered into force in 1950. So irrespective of the moment of Russia joining or entering into the convention system, the concept of values, fundamental underlying values, does not apply, because there were no such values for the convention before the existence of the convention, even if these are fundamental principles of international law, or jus cogens, or what's not. It doesn't matter. Nothing before 1950 applies. Now, you rightly said that this is not the moment to enter into the evaluation of the jurisprudence of the court. That's the law, and I was asked to interpret the law. And basically, some of the applications were rejected because the relatives were not close enough. And as to the Article 3 complaint, again, they said that it doesn't reach a sufficiently high level of suffering because all the suffering has already occurred before. Okay, so I try to simplify and present it in a rather brutal way, but that's the whole thing. That it became known to the applicants that their relatives passed away, so there is no more additional emotional distress reaching the level of inhuman and degrading treatment. Because once again, they did know by the time the Russians did not disclose further information. They did know what happened to their loved one, and therefore the rest is not sufficient based on, and they cite left and right, I think 24 of cases supporting this. So that's basically Janowiec. And of course, I'm not here to try to figure out if there is a way to overcome all these difficulties, but difficulties, they do exist. No question about that. So that's all I can report from the perspective of Janowiec.
Thank you, Professor Scheil. I just have another question, because I just what you said does not sound very promising for the relatives of victims. The court rejected these applications because the convention was not applicable at the time of the crimes. But in my opinion, I mean, if I would try to help the relatives, the cases that we discussed today are different from Janowiec in a sense that the alleged violation in these cases happened now. So the rehabilitation constitutes a violation. not the crime that happened during the Second World War. So the rehabilitation of a criminal constitutes a violation of the victim's rights. And unlike all of these previous cases in Janowitz, the alleged violation happened when the convention did apply in the member state. That would be one view, one way of looking at it. I don't know what you think about that.
That's certainly a way to distinguish out if the court wishes so, but as I say, they have enough ammunition to disregard it. For example, one can argue that the fact of quashing a judgment resulting in a de facto lack of conviction after 70 or 80, now what, 70 years or so, right? More than 70 or 40. Yeah, it's 80 years. That is not a inhuman treatment based on the case law. Frankly, if I were aware of a case where acquittal in these circumstances would amount to violation, yeah, maybe, but as I say, we have cases where acquittal meant a procedural violation of Article 2. In that case, however, you have to find a gross violation of domestic law. The court is these days is of a mood that they will not replace the evaluation of domestic facts unless this is manifestly illegal. So even that argument may run into serious substantive objections. But you're absolutely right, that seems to be the only way to go, to find a workaround regarding Janowitz.
Thank you. I will take this opportunity to ask one more question. It's not a European Court of Human Rights related question, but since you asked me so many hard questions in 23 years ago in the classroom in Budapest, I will return the favor. So I would like to know what you, as a lawyer, how you see these rehabilitations. Courts annul convictions, overturn judgments, old judgments after decades or centuries for procedural reasons or for lack of due process, violations of defendant rights. The courts in UK and America, in the United States, have overturned convictions of witches, which were, I think, like 400 years old convictions. And the public is often sympathetical to, let's say, these alleged witches or people the public deems innocent. And the same public is outraged when war criminals' convictions are overturned for these same reasons, procedural rights, due process, and so on. So some say the court should be blind to who was the convict and what he has done. And the others believe that courts should not be crime blind or convict blind, and they should, when they rehabilitate, they should consider whether this person was, in their view, or it was innocent or guilty. So they should not rehabilitate for the same reasons, just everyone. They should also consider who was the person who was convicted and what he has done. How do you see that? Which approach do you think is,
Yuri,
the right one.
Before we get to that, can you, I'm supposed to be the dictator of time, and I don't want to be. Can you tell me if we are allowed to overrun?
Yes, we are.
Okay, so because I think that at the end, if there are people who want to ask questions and others who have to leave, then we can continue a bit with the questions. Is that all right? So then we can go back to Professor Shayo.
Very good idea.
Sorry, Professor Shai, do you have a response to
what I had in mind is that the next speaker shall have the opportunity to express views, and time allowing, if it's needed, I will be happy to respond. This is typical of a student in the classroom. So if the professor needs to explain something, the student shall be silent. So I would like to be silent and allow myself to prepare myself. Once again, if there will be time, I will be happy to answer the question. But I think at the moment, we should proceed according to the original plan and have the opportunity to discuss further issues. If there is an agreement.
That is fine. I'm just trying. So now that we're not allowed to call her Baroness, we'll call her Ruth Deitch, a very prominent person in this field, and a very distinguished lawyer herself, I may say. Ruth.
Thank you. Poland is very much in the news at the moment, generously receiving thousands of Ukrainian refugees. But look a little deeper, and there are clues to the story I'm about to tell of its failure to live up to legal and moral responsibility for the return, or at the very least, the commemoration of the property that belonged to its 3 million Jewish citizens before the war, and which is now in the hands of strangers. I'm trying to get this slide to move. There we are. At least 2 million Poles left Poland once it had joined the EU. There are, I imagine, empty villages, a declining population, and job vacancies. So maybe there is room for Ukrainians. And they have done a generous job of receiving them. There are stories that African students fleeing Ukraine are not welcome, though this is contested. What is certain is that for years, Poland has refused Muslim migrants, contrary to EU requirements, and has pushed them back at the Belarus border. It prefers migrants of its own kind. In another area, Poland is also exceptional. The Holocaust was not only genocide, it was also the greatest theft in history. The Nazis and later the communists too took people's lives and their property. To this day, the Polish government is obstructing the return of property that belonged to its 3 million Jewish victims who had lived there, 90% of whom perished. And it resists all attempts to legislate for this, as other countries have done. It is alone in modern Europe in not facing up to the moral restoration that is needed. Indeed, it is going further recently in rewriting the story of the World War to suit its national narrative. There were about 6 restitution conferences and some minor legislative efforts before 2009, which saw the Prague Conference resulting in the Terezin Declaration. Poland attended that conference, but has subsequently ignored it. The declaration called for support for the welfare of the survivors, a diminishing number, many of whom live in poverty, restitution of personal, cultural, and communal property, archival access to enable claims to be made, Holocaust education, remembrance, and the preservation of memorials, and measures to combat anti-Semitism. It is hard to see any success in any of these goals in Poland. It is possible for survivors to initiate claims in Polish courts, but this is complicated by the understandable lack of ownership documentation, the complications of communist-era nationalization, the slowness and bureaucracy of the procedure, and sometimes the failure to stand by the judgment. There has been little success before the European Court of Human Rights, however. That court calls for Polish domestic remedies to be exhausted before application, and that is often impossible, and the international litigation interminable. Sometimes it is claimed that Poland is just waiting for the claimants to die off. On more than a dozen occasions, Poland has drafted legislation that would facilitate restitution, as has happened in, for example, Austria and other countries, but failed to enact it. This is despite calls by the Council of Europe and the European Parliament, the OSCE, the US Senate and Congress. Restitution was to have been a condition of Poland's entry to the EU, but was abandoned at the last minute on the ground of its then weak economy. So what should we do? The British government and the UN Human Rights Council should take a number of measures, as I set out here. The Polish government should be required to ease the evidential requirements imposed on potential claimants who are required to litigate in Poland. Litigation should be possible outside of Poland. Litigants should be given access to the records. Poland should set up a central fund to pay at least a small percentage to claimants. The British government should follow the example of the US government in passing a statute like theirs, Justice for Uncompensated Survivors, requiring annual reporting every year on progress. And the Council of Europe should take this up again on grounds of the breach of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 4598 of 1990. And so should the EU in reliance on the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. Poland opted out of enforcement of the Lisbon Treaty. It gets worse. Jaroslav Nowak, a Polish diplomat charged with improving contacts with the Jewish diaspora, was fired recently after he criticized his own government's failure to pass a restitution law. Last year, Poland approved a law that sharply restricted the rights to reclaim property, allegedly in the interest of certainty. A law that provoked a diplomatic dispute with Israel. Some progress has been made with communal property, for example, graveyards, but the claimants must deal with their own upkeep. Whenever I speak publicly about this, I get anti-Semitic comments by email and reports and cartoons like this in the Polish press, accusing me of greed, theft, etc. Here's another one. Poland's position is that she is the victim of the Nazis and is not responsible for the expropriations carried out by the German occupiers, even though that property is now situated in Polish borders and is changing hands in a series of sales. Poland's inward-looking denial over the morality of restitution is also reflected in its attitude to the rule of law. Since taking power in 2015, the ironically named Law and Justice Party has taken bold moves against the judiciary. It has given the Justice Minister the power to appoint and dismiss presidents and deputy presidents of courts. It has decreed that the body that nominates judges should be largely peopled by parliamentary appointees, and it lowered retrospectively the age of retirement of judges, albeit that this was reversed after a ruling from the European Court of Justice that it was in breach of European law. It also set up a new disciplinary chamber which could undermine the independence of judges. Not only that, but judges who question the validity of all these judicial reforms would themselves be subjected to discipline. the European Parliament resolved that there had been attacks on judicial independence in Poland, so as to warrant the Article 7 procedure, referring the situation for consideration by the European Court of Justice. This has culminated in the imposition by the European Commission of financial penalties on Poland. The European Court of Justice recently ruled that it was legal for the Commission to hold back budget funding to a country in breach of the conditions, including the observance of the rule of law, attached to it. It would not be surprising, however, if Poland puts forward the situation of its significant expenditure on Ukrainian refugees as a countermeasure. Free speech about the Holocaust and restitution is also under attack in Poland. In 2018, a law was enacted that would criminalize any accusation of Polish complicity during the Nazi occupation. This followed on a 1998 Act on the Institute of National Remembrance, which was designed to prevent Holocaust denial. The 2018 Act was an amendment to it. After protests, the 2018 Act was softened to remove the criminal penalties, reducing it to a civil offence. Nevertheless, the participation by individual Poles in the murder and betrayal of their Jewish neighbours during the war is documented. For example, in Jedwabne, where in 1941 over 300 Jews were murdered by 40 Polish compatriots. There were comparable pogroms in many other towns as well. And then after the war, there were still pogroms, for example, in Kielce. Recently, historians Jan Grabowski and Barbara Engelking were accused of violating the new law in their study of the fate of Jews in Poland during the war. Those two scholars were accused of slandering the memory of the uncle of the litigant, whom they alleged had betrayed the hiding place of Jews in his town. On appeal, those two scholars were acquitted, but the case is now regarded as an example of the chilling effect of the 2018 law on Holocaust scholarship. This Polish law is an example of how many countries, even including the United Kingdom, are bending the story of the Holocaust to suit a national narrative. In the case of Poland, they want to show the good behavior of the Polish citizens during the war. In the case of the United Kingdom, they want to show how British values are a bulwark against anti-Semitism and genocide, that being the theme of the planned 6th Holocaust Memorial for London. Globally, as the years go by, there is little support for elderly, impoverished survivors and their property. Disregard of the measures of the Terrorism Declaration and increased anti-Semitism, often perpetrated in the name of anti-Israelism. Holocaust education has failed by presenting that episode, the Holocaust, and only that, as the nature of anti-Semitism, and not setting it in context or bringing it up to the present day. There is much more to be done. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ruth. It's very sobering, and I think I have some similar things, but with regard to my encounters with German officialdom and some of the same things. I'm going to now focus on Germany and its refusal to recognize that Nazi slave labor was illegal and its tactics to avoid its obligations. And this is just one other dimension of Holocaust injustice, although we're not going to be able to exhaust some of the other dimensions, I mean, such as the questions of ability for free speech, because just as you've talked about the risk of legal action, there is a risk of libel if one makes certain statements about the Holocaust, and that risk has definitely been imposed and repeatedly by powerful institutions in Germany. I myself have had to keep from publication a long document simply because I couldn't afford to employ a libel lawyer just to check that I was safe from harassment if I published it. And now I think we need to give much higher priority to studying carefully and at a high academic and judicial level the main legal principles involved and the main practical avenues that will come ahead. And I think one thing that has emerged from the discussion that we've had already is that there are technical legal points that will have to be discussed very carefully and in general if we're to make progress on this matter. And there were warnings from Professor Scheil about what the European Court could and couldn't do. There were other possibilities mentioned by Ruth and still others that are under discussion that Robert Williams was talking about. But this is something that has to be considered very carefully. And I think my experience has been that class action lawyers who want to represent clients in order to get a share of whatever settlement there is tend to go for very rich clients or groups of clients and leave many other matters unlooked at. And this is the same with what you were talking about, Ruth, about elderly Holocaust survivors in Poland who don't have the money to employ very expensive lawyers or lawyers who will look for big rewards at the end and are willing to carry cases through. And so ordinary survivors, which actually is the great majority, and their dependents and descendants are often practically unrepresented, unfortunately. And I also think that quite apart from the search for money, it actually isn't always rich, greedy survivors who want to lay their hands on money. Often there are matters of principle. I know of people that the idea that their belongings shouldn't be theirs, that their lives are not whole without some form of justice coming there. And I think the misrepresentation of restitution that you have suffered, Ruth, and you were well illustrating that, is part of this. And so I haven't believed that the search, in my case, for slave labor compensation has been anything to do with money, because I have, and my family has refused to accept any money that's on offer for precisely that reason. We felt it's dirty money, even though it's for ourselves. But there are basic principles that are also involved in securing justice. Now, I'd like to go back to Rob Williams's point that I do think that it's not only countries in Central and Eastern Europe. I think some of the real problems have come from the original perpetrator countries, Germany and Austria, whose records actually have been, I think, extremely defective. There is a recent book by a very prominent British historian, Professor Mary Fulbrook, called Reckonings. And those reckonings are actually quite grim that she records. And I have been in correspondence with her, resulting from my experience with German officialdom, several ambassadors, minister, etc. The German position was that claims against German corporations which used slave laborers could only be considered after what technically had been defined in the early 1950s as the final settlement of World War II in a peace treaty. And in the German unification talks of 1990, we know now that the West German government deliberately worked to avoid the 2+4 treaty, the unification treaty, of being a peace treaty and of being a final settlement. And they did this specifically so that they could say the war isn't over and will never be over. And until it's over, we can't consider claims for Jewish slave labor. I mean, that was the position, and it's in the records that I may put on file after this meeting. And so it was only in 1977 that a law case decided within Germany that, functionally speaking, the unification treaty was the equivalent of a final settlement, although it had been intended not that there should be no final settlement of the Second World War. And so that opened the way for claims against German companies in the courts. Some of the British survivors of Auschwitz came to me for some help in this. Now, at the beginning, there were negotiations with the United States and Germany to see if there could be some settlement that would avoid the litigation in the American courts. In one of those meetings, a German ambassador to London, after asking Auschwitz survivor Rudy Kennedy about his slave labor in the Brunel works at the Auschwitz camp, turned to me to declare, he said, "Professor, you realize that strictly speaking, there was nothing illegal in Mr. Kennedy's slave labor in Auschwitz." Now, incredible as it seems, that remains the official German position. There are some complications in this, that there are some variations that say, oh no, it was illegal but not actionable, or something else. But essentially, the case of the German government is that they maintain that the use of slave labor in the concentration camps was legal, that they're therefore willing, as a goodwill gesture, as a charitable gesture, to have an agreement which would give a very minor amount of gifts to any claimants, and these would be non-Jewish as well as Jewish claimants, on condition not only that they gave up any future legal claims by accepting this small amount, a few $1,000s, but also that the American government, and by implication also the Israeli government, agreed that they wouldn't support in future American courts where this was being tried any future claims. And this was part, and there was agreement, regrettably, to those conditions. And I was in conflict with the chief US negotiator, Stu Eisenstadt. I thought it was wrong to accept that, but the reason he accepted was that he foresaw that there would be such delaying tactics by the German side that there would be what the Jewish Claims Conference called a biological solution, namely that everybody would die before they would get anything from the German courts, which is what Ruth has been saying about the Polish courts as well. And so there was an agreement that a very disadvantageous settlement would be reached, which wouldn't involve any recognition of German legal wrongdoing, but just as a nice moral gesture. the survivors I represented were unwilling to accept it. And I remember a phone call. I was in Warsaw at the time with one of the chief lawyers, or it may even have been Stu Eisender. I think it was a lawyer. And he said, look, Michael, if you get your survivors to accept this, you can tell their leader, Rudy Kennedy, that I can arrange for tea in the White House with Bill Clinton. And so I said afterwards to Rudy Kennedy, so I said, look, Rudy, if you want to give up all of your claims and the other claims, you know what, you can have tea in the White House. And so he, not unpredictably, refused this and said, I'm going to go to Berlin, where the grand meeting to greet this rotten deal will be announced, and I want to protest against it. At that stage, the lawyers said that they hadn't been able to get hold of Rudy Kennedy. He'd never reached them. And it was a friend within the German legal circle who got him a place to go to this meeting and hold a press conference to protest against the deal that the American government had done with the German government, which was incidentally to the advantage of the class action lawyers who got several $1 million each, although many of them had told the survivors that if they signed up to the case, that they, the lawyers, were doing it pro bono. And so that is that background. What was, I think, even more incredible was some of the pleadings that the German government put before the American courts in the case. I mean, they argued, for example, that first of all, that it was too late to make claims, that having delayed them for 50 years and saying it was too early, they now were saying it was too late. A next argument, and I kid you not, was that Jewish slave laborers ought to be grateful for being slave laborers, because if they hadn't been slave laborers, they would have gone to the gas chambers. And so their lives were being saved by being slave laborers. And therefore, it was like impertinence, not only to be ungrateful that they'd been saved, but actually to ask for some payment for their slave labor. There were other arguments. I mean, they were so absurd that that you can go on, but they were seriously made by the German authorities. One was that actually Auschwitz wasn't in Germany; it had been in Poland, and therefore the claim should be made to the Polish government and not the German government. And so it goes on. I had a list of these ridiculous reasons, but I would really overrun my time on this. There were equally crass excuses given by Germany for not itself providing money for restitution of confiscated Jewish property in Central Eastern Europe. Now, I think that what I would say is that we're not only dealing with legal claims here and justice, as important as that is, but we're also dealing with the perversion of history. Because in the course of defending themselves, the German courts employed selective historians who would always include a Jewish historian to give legitimacy to the action. And they would produce official histories. And now these official histories, and I've dealt with numbers of them and have written publicly about it, tended to make certain qualified admissions, as if to say, look, we must be honest because we're admitting certain things. But by admitting the smaller things, they then either pushed to very small margins of their study or ignored them together much more serious things. And this applies, for example, to the histories of the Deutsche Bank or the histories of Volkswagen. And so what you've had is a process of distortion of history through allowing access to files to small groups of chosen and paid historians rather than opening them to the general public. And that was something that has happened for many years. It happened, for example, to the Deutsche Bank files, where the files individually of Hermann Abs, the person most responsible for the, responsible for the funding of the Bühne works at Auschwitz, about which he knew nothing, supposedly. But his papers we weren't allowed to see because it might offend his daughter. And various other excuses that came. So I think that the question of access to archives is a very important and remaining issue. I won't go any further than that, except to say that I think there are many unfinished issues. Numbers of them are legal issues, and that they ought to have more prominence, and they deserve a very concerted, high-level discussion of the principles involved. And I hope that this meeting this afternoon can have an encouraging effect in that direction. Thank you. Now, can we go first to our assigned commentator, and then I'd like to go to the participants as a whole, and if we then people can leave at the appropriate time if they have to go, and then a few of us can remain in conversation. So Professor Gardasevich, can we go for some comments from you? Professor Gardasevich from Zagreb.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pinto-Duschinsky, and for the invitation and the opportunity to participate here. I will try to be as brief as possible, although, of course, I'm open to all the questions possible in the discussion section. Yuri Toplak kindly asked me to take a look at the creation case, maybe related to what we are talking about here today. It concerns the conviction of the Croatian Zagreb Archbishop Alojzije Stipinac, who was serving his time as the Archbishop during the period of the Second World War as well. After the war in 1946, he was convicted on the basis of various acts then regulated in the criminal law. And in 2016, he was rehabilitated through the process in which the decision from 46 was annulled. Now, briefly, the objections that the county court found in 2016 were based both on procedural and substantive grounds. Principally, the substantive objections were found in the violation of nullum crimen nulla pena sine lege principle in various aspects, prohibition of analogy, prohibition of retroactivity, requirement that criminal acts should be precisely defined, and so on. From the fair trial standing or point of view, the court also found objections to, in terms of the right to an independent and impartial trial, right to attorney, right to appeal, safety and security, and also to this, there was in a separate section added that his right to free expression and speech was violated. Now, what the court did in 2016 in annulling the decision from 1946, it went through all three principal grounds for reviewing the decision, meaning substantive law, procedural requirements, and the establishment of facts, actually. I will just briefly give some information on what was found to be problematic, and I believe that this might be the case in the Slovenian example as well. And I will make actually a reference to what Professor Ribičič and both Professor Šaja expressed in their previous explanations, because I find that to be the connecting point between the Croatian example and the European Convention on Human Rights and the Slovenian case as well. The objections in the due process were numerous. Among those, as I said, was that the person was deprived of the right to appeal. It was excluded, even though death penalty was possible to be imposed at that time. His freedom to establish a connection with the attorney, defense lawyer, was very, very limited. Public prosecutor at that time, according to the existing law in 1946, public prosecutor led the investigation in the process instead of the judge. That's what the Court of Appeals said in 2016. Several procedures were combined into one in a very short period of time, during which other important procedural guarantees for the defendant were violated as well. Apart from that, there was some changes in the law immediately before the trial took place in 1946. So there was a combination of applicable rules, because he was convicted on the basis of some guidelines, not exactly the laws, but the guidelines regulating the criminal procedure, which were enacted even during the Second World War, later amended in 1946, immediately prior to the trial. The trial took place for several days, during which a number of defendants were convicted, 13 in total. Then equality of arms was violated, the court said. Among these witnesses that appeared on the trial, only, the court says, only 8 witnesses were allowed for the defendant and 61 witnesses for the prosecution. We could go on. Among those things, the court found objections in terms of the violation of Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 10 as well, as I said, and general principles of law, prohibition of retroactivity, prohibition of analogy in criminal law, and fair trial. Now, if anyone is interested, I could go with details. I don't want to consume any more time, because this is just a commentary that I give after this very fruitful and successful panel. But I just want to make one reference which occurred to me while I was listening to, especially Professor Ribičič and Professor Šaja were telling before, as I said, as I promised. The important thing, and I assume that that could be the grounds for further research on this case, although procedurally it's closed. We talked about the standing problems and the issues related to the right to go to international tribunals. This case is closed. You cannot appeal anymore to the Constitutional Court or further than that. But in terms of the standards applicable, Professor Ribičič already said that the Slovenian case is comparable to the law existing in similar cases at the time. He mentioned the London Agreement and the Nuremberg trial. And as far as I understood, there is some grounds to claim, to argue that those standards applicable in international tribunals were comparable to what was going on in Slovenia. So that may be the ground for further research. In the Croatian case, I still miss that part of the judgment. Although the court made references to the European Convention on Human Rights, I still miss to see a more substantive or profound or thorough examination of comparisons of those standards which were valid at the time. The same goes for the argument of Professor Šaja, if I understood him correctly, and I believe that I did, when he said that the objection in the Polish case was that the European Convention was not applicable because it entered into the force in 1950. And even though that the fundamentals underlying the convention were not found to be existing at the time, so that this was the problem for accepting the case. Now, my suggestion, and I close with this, is that in these two, although the court definitely raised some serious objections in terms of retroactivity and fair trial, that's quite okay. But what I would, as a constitutional lawyer, like to see examined more in depth is that type of comparison between the existing standards at the time in international tribunals and the procedure that was given to the defendant in the Croatian case. That's just a hint for a maybe possible discussion later on or further questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Now, where do we go from here? Can I have your advice, Yuri, as to how we proceed? Do I just ask for questions? Or I don't see any raised hands. I've got one Q&A question here. And should I go on to that question, Yuri?
Yeah. I would let you decide how to proceed, but maybe we should just invite the audience to ask questions either in chat or in the Q&A or with raising hands, and they get the microphone.
I think that what I propose to do is to ask at the beginning for any raised hands, and then if not that, what I'd like to do is to just have a quick round of the panelists to see if they can come back with remarks, and then I think we have to bring to a close. And so is there anybody who wants to raise a hand? Okay, well, look, if we don't get there, I'd like to then go through just for 1 or 2 minutes each, unless you really want more, each of the panelists in the same order that we had before. I will give up having any more comments from this. So, Professor Ribičič.
Yes, thank you. I would have only one remark. When we filed the constitutional complaints, it was very important that Professor Michael Pinto-Duschinsky wrote an article in the article in the about this Rupnik case. He consulted our ambassador in London before, and it was not important just because I do accept his remarks, but it was important because we saw in Slovenia that international community is watching us. That was especially important. And I would repeat only one sentence from his article, that the partisans were to take cruel revenge against Home Guard after the defeat of Hitler does not diminish the appalling wartime actions of pro-Nazi Slovenians. I do agree with this point. We put it down in our complaints, and I would like to thank Mr. Sayo and other participants who give us some points important for the European Court of Human Rights. I already said that I hope that we wouldn't need it, that it will be the case will be closed before the Constitutional Court of Slovenia, but anyway, we have to be prepared for the European Court of Human Rights too. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Cyril. Rob Williams, please.
I see that Daniel's hand is up. I don't know if there is something that needs to be managed first.
Oh, yes,
yeah, no worries.
Right.
Robert, you can go ahead. You can be first. No worries.
Okay, and I will apologize. I will have to leave at about 1/2 the hour for a meeting. I do want to respond to a few things that were said in the other presentations and to reflect on something that might be helpful here. First, I want to key off of something that Baroness Dietsch raised, her statement that Holocaust education has failed. I think it's important to look at this in a very particular way. I would not say that Holocaust education per se has failed. Holocaust education has raised awareness of the Holocaust and related atrocities on a global scale. Just think of where Holocaust knowledge was 20 years ago. However, her point is well taken because there has been a tendency, particularly by policymakers in the education and cultural sectors, to assume that awareness of the Holocaust would be a panacea against anti-Semitism. And that approach by policymakers has failed. Awareness to fight anti-Semitism requires knowledge of more than just the Holocaust. Rather, it requires a knowledge of the wide range of Jewish experiences and how Jews have contributed to our politics, to our cultures, and to our societies in order to fight back against anti-Semitism. Specific to something that you said, Michael, that Germany and Austria are problematic. I want to be clear, I did not say that. I was making reference to problems that we see outside of countries that were part of the Axis or occupied by the Axis. In countries like my own, the United States, where you have diaspora communities erecting statues to Nazi collaborators, where members of the SS who joined the early versions of NASA are lionized for their contributions to our space program. If we are not willing to interrogate and engage with that past in an honest way, how can we expect those countries most affected by the Holocaust to do so? So that's what I was speaking of there, and I would not like that point to get lost. Finally, in hearing all of these presentations about the intersections between, we'll call it judicial truth and historical truth, it may be necessary to reflect on something that other researchers, including some researchers at the University of Bari like Giorgio Resta, have written, that since at least the Nuremberg trial, the boundaries between historical and legal adjudication have become blurred. You know, courts have become an arena where history as such is being tried because the public likes to believe that courts yield an impartial truth about the past. But the burdens of truth differ between my profession and those of the jurists on the panel. Court decisions are essentially final and official. A judge makes a decision. But historical truths are much less official. They're rather unofficial. They're the product of a consensus, and quite honestly, they're the product of a burden of proof that is much larger. You know, the knowledge of what happened during the Holocaust at the time of the Nuremberg trial was much smaller and much narrower than what we know now. Reference was made earlier to Katyn, for example. Katyn was a topic that could not be discussed until historians actually got to the subject. So we need to recognize the distinctions between these two as we try to bring clarity to an increasingly complex problem. With that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Since you mentioned what I'd said, I will in turn make a clarification. I certainly don't think that that Germany, Austria as a whole, that you can generalize to that extent. And in fact, some of the most important support, I gave one example in my remarks, but there are others, have come from those countries. However, I think that in general, the situation has been far less satisfactory than is often made out. That it is certainly true that the German authorities have been willing to put quite a lot of money into funding research, and that money has sometimes had unfortunate effects in committing people to their point of view. This is a subject that I study from my professional point of view as a political scientist in party funding, and that it is remarkable what effects the receipt of funding has on the results. There is an academic based in Jerusalem who did a study of a set of historians. I think these were Israeli historians who received German money and those who hadn't, and correlated their views. And this was published by the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. I can let you have it, but I know that all of my historian friends, and some of them don't become friends, do determine that they could never be affected by their funding. Well, there you go. But thank you very much for taking part, Rob, and I think to be followed from here. Okay, now Daniel, can we come to
Yes.
you?
Hi, thank you very much, Michael. I'm sorry for maybe possible noises around me because there are some people around me, so I'm very sorry for that. I would just like to take this chance to express my gratitude to all of you. I'm a historian, and it's an honor for me to be in the company of you guys, of great legal experts. But I also think that in those kind of situations, we have to look from a historical context as well. So about, maybe I have some opinions about Rupnik, and I would like to light up some most visible similar cases abroad with comparison on how elsewhere is done and how in Slovenia. So Rupnik wasn't just a war criminal. He was also, as already said, he was also a notorious anti-Semite as well. I think, in my opinion, one of the most sinister persons in Slovenian history, and he's on the brink of rehabilitation. From historical point of view, as a historian, I look on rehabilitation as a shame for the whole society, and especially for the ones who fought against Nazi tyranny, and for the victims as well. I think that the one who actively collaborated with Nazi Germany, the one who's guilty or responsible for war crimes, and the one who was sending people into concentration camps can't and shouldn't be rehabilitated, never. I think somewhere you have to draw a line. For some things, there's just no apologies. I don't know if that's familiar to you, but Rupnik was also a deserter as well. According to our Yugoslavian army and navy law, General Rupnik was degraded and convicted for deserter. That was in November 1941, and to add to this, with that he received also death conviction, because the military criminal code of Kingdom of Yugoslavia says that the Yugoslavian officer who willingly trespass or surrender himself to the enemy, he's convicted with death penalty as well. So that's also a thought I wanted to share, and some things also about the countries, how elsewhere is done. For example, I'm sorry, I'm just translating from Slovenian directly to English. For example, I will try to be short. In November 2018, there was a 100th anniversary of end of First World War, and on that day, in November 2018, there was a French president, Emmanuel Macron, who said that he will honor 8 French marshals from the First World War. So the 8 soldiers who were responsible for French victory in First World War. So between those 8 marshals, in the end, he also mentioned French Marshal Philippe Pétain, and his sentence was that it's possible that someone from the First World War is a great hero, but in the Second World War he accepted some critical or mistaken decisions. So after that, there was a big uproar in the society, and Macron quickly changed his mind in one night, and he said that that he's sorry for that. Then, for example, we have the very similar cases as case with Rupnik also. For example, in Norway, the verdict against Norwegian Vidkun Quisling, so he was the leader of puppet regime of Norway. So that verdict was also not overruled. And he was tried and sentenced to death. So at his villa, the Norwegians established the Museum of Holocaust. That was in 2005, and the word Quisling became the synonym for traitor and collaborator. So we have many cases like this in abroad. For example, similar case was also with Ion Antonescu, so the fascist from Romania, who was also in the rehabilitation process, but then it was decided not to rehabilitate him. So that's how it's.
Daniel, what I'm going to do, because of the time, is that we're going to have a site on this, and I think both for Rob Williams, who's done so much work on this, and for you, I'd like some contributions that we can look at on paper for this that will allow the follow-up, because we don't have a full time for that now.
Yes, sure.
Is that all right?
Yes, sure. I was on the end. I just wanted to say those are some positive examples on how it should be done also in Slovenia. That's my point of view from a historical point.
Okay, great. Well, look, we'd look forward to that. I would then go, can I miss you out, Yuri? Because I'd like to have Professor Shayo and then Ruth to draw things to a close now, because I think we are overrunning fairly seriously. Professor Shayo, do you have anything more to say?
Well, all I have to say, other than being illuminated in many things, in particular, what you said about the negotiations, which I think is the legal reality in these matters. It's dirty, and it's not at the level of justice that one would expect, especially in such cases. But that's a very personal view. As a scholarly view, or as a recollection of what I experienced as a judge, judges are extremely afraid to get into history. You can read in so many cases that it is not the role of a court to render justice in historical matters. That's for historians. Then, de facto, they do legitimize certain things. Unfortunately, there is some kind of hypocrisy here. But this is always disguised in a legalistic rule of law type of reasoning. So in a way, courts are not I'm not talking about reparations, but the kind of case that was the center of our discussions. The courts are dangerous for winning the public mind, because they may send the wrong message. And I think one has to be very careful if one has a general agenda of educating the people to what extent one should rely on courts, because the courts follow their own logic, and that logic is not the logic of historical justice or recognition of historical injustice. And sometimes the position of a court can be turned against historical justice. Very briefly, one example is the Armenian genocide. I was in one formation, and because of considerations of freedom of expression, we had to conclude, it was then accepted at the level of the Grand Chamber, that a denial of the genocide committed by the Turks to the detriment of Armenian population, that is not something one can punish, because I don't want to enter to technicalities. But the message was terrible, because many of us were personally convinced that there was a genocide to the detriment of Armenians. But that did not play a role in the judgment. And then the consequences were that the Armenians felt betrayed, and those denialists in Turkey felt, relieved. That was not the intention of the court, and there was a general agreement that this case will result in finding that the person who denied it in a certain way has to be acquitted. But you force the applicants or this Turkish guy forced the court to take a position that certainly backfires on historical memory. So I just mentioned this was one of the most difficult cases personally for me. I wrote with a colleague of mine a very long concurring opinion explaining that this is not about that was just of little help. So I am very much aware of the limits of using courts for historical purposes. There might be victims, they might have a cause, they might be entitled to restoration or other things, but what you get from a court may not help.
May I suggest that, Professor Shayo, that this seems like a very interesting point of wider application. Is this concurring opinion in English at all, or
yes,
maybe we could have that reference for our website as well?
Okay, I will give you the reference. Okay.
Thank you very much. Now we'll go to. Thank you so much. And now, Ruth, can you bring us to a close?
What I've learned from this session, reinforcing really what I already thought, is that the courts are not helping. Time is going by, survivors are dying, even their heirs and successors are getting old, as we are on this panel. And I think some states are spending millions of pounds on commemorative events and memorials, which frankly do no good at all. I'd rather see them spend that money on the survivors, but there seems to be an unwillingness on the part of states to address those matters. They take refuge in parades and commemorations and memorials and so on, which frankly don't do the survivors and the claimants any good at all. I think it's time to call for states that are affected to legislate and cut the Gordian knot and get money to those who ought to have it now.
I agree with you, Ruth. Look, do you want to bring us procedurally to an end, Yuri? I'd like to thank the seminar and all of that. A great deal of work has gone into bringing together, I think, an exceptional panel. I will look forward to results on the website and other things, but I'd like to thank you very much and to hand over to you to get us over and out. Yuri.
Thank you, Michael. I would like to say at the end that I would like this to be not the end of something, but at the beginning, and that we should either continue our research, or we should maybe try to make a special issue of some journal, or a collection of papers, or an edited volume, or something that we should develop this further. And I would like to invite everyone to the project. Thank you everyone for your time and for participating in this event. We will publish it on our website, and Michael and I and Daniel will develop the website further to add a collection of documents, and then further on. Thank you, and Michael, special thanks to you for putting the whole panel together and developing the structure and the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Say goodbye now. All the very best.